So they said, why stay at a inn owned by white people? Why don't you stay at a hotel or motel owned by a black person? So he said, that's fine. And so they booked him in the Lorraine Motel owned by a black person. And he was initially given a room on the first floor. For some strange reason, he was moved to the second floor. And at 6 o'clock that evening, he was standing out on the balcony, had his hand on the rail, talking to someone on the first floor, and a shot rang out from across the street, hit him in the jaw, broke a couple of vertebrae in his neck, ended up just under the skin on his back, and he died from that one shot. Now, the official investigation says that James Earl Ray was the shooter of Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray was a habitual criminal. His father was a habitual criminal. His brother was a habitual criminal. There's a FBI agent, a code name Raoul, had contacted James Earl Ray and told him meet him in Memphis there behind Jim's Grill. And so he did, and Raoul told James to go to the local gun shop and get a rifle with a scope on it. James got in his Mustang and drove to this gun shop, brought a rifle back, handed it to Raoul, and Raoul said, you idiot, this is a .243 caliber. Take it back and trade it for a .30-06. Now the distance from the shooter to King was something like 30 or 40 yards. A .243 is just as deadly as a .30-06. Why would he exchange the gun? Because the real shooter had a .30-06. And the law said that James was standing on the rim of a bathtub on the second floor of the flop house above Jim's Grill, shooting out of the window of this bathroom. And again, I was going through the photographs of the Associated Press and just flipping through them, and all of a sudden a photograph appeared, and it was a photograph taken from that window looking at the balcony where King was standing at the time of the shooting. And there was the leaves were off the trees, but there was a tree in the way, and so you could not get a clean shot at King from that window. Now the next day after King was killed, the Memphis Public Works Department came in and cut down all the bushes and trees on that ledge across from the Lorraine Hotel, looking for evidence. Right. They didn't want anybody to see that there was not a clean shot from that window. Now, when the shot was fired, there was a black lady named Betty Scaife that was a waitress in Jim's Grill. She heard the shot and went immediately into the kitchen. She thought something blew up. And as she entered the kitchen, the back door opened, and a fellow named Lloyd Jowers, the owner of Jim's Grill, entered the kitchen with a rifle with a scope on it in his hand. He slammed the door and said, "Woman, get up front and work on the customers." Betty went back up front. Lloyd ejected the spent cartridge, bent it on the counter, and threw it in the commode, flushed the commode, and it stopped up. Well, he had to fish it out, and he cleaned it up, put it in his pocket, and later threw it in the river, the Mississippi River. But the rifle, he tore it, broke it down, wrapped it in a tablecloth, and put it on the counter, and later he hid it. Well, how do I know this? Okay, there's a dear friend of mine is a private investigator in Memphis, and I spent 3 nights and days in his home, and we were going over all of this, and he said, you know, there's one person that no one that I know of has ever talked to, and he really knows what went on in that case. I suggest you try to find him. I think he went to jail or something in Texas. Well, sort of sneaky guy, I found him in prison, and I interviewed him 3 times. I couldn't get him to go on video, but my friend told me that this fella came to Memphis 2 days after King was killed, and his first job in Memphis was a cab driver for Lloyd Jowers, and they became friends. And In fact, this fellow ended up as vice president of Lloyd Jowers Company. And one of the services that Lloyd Jowers Company provided was they were contract killers in the Memphis area. They'd killed about a dozen people in the Memphis area, Lloyd Jowers and this fellow. And so he said one night Lloyd Jowers and this fellow were out drinking, got skunk drunk, and Lloyd Jowers started bragging to him about being the actual shooter of King and told him where the rifle was. And this fellow, when I talked to him in prison, he says, if you could get me out of prison, he was only interested in getting himself out. He was in for 30 years on a cocaine charge. He had been caught with a kilo of cocaine and a mandatory sentence of 30 years in Texas. But he wanted me to try to get him out, and he kept holding out. But he said, now, if you can get me out, I'll tell you exactly where the rifle is, and I'll tell you everything about it. Of course, he told me, but he said, I'll do it on camera. And I'm not sure the guy's still alive. I wrote him a letter about a month ago and told him I was trying to get the governor to give him a pardon if he would testify about that case. And I never did hear from him. So I need to call the guy that's in charge of public relations and see if he's still alive, because I have contacted Governor of Texas and tried to get him to issue immunity to witnesses or to issue a pardon for anyone that's been committed a crime if they will produce evidence. And hadn't been able to get him to do that yet. But I'm not the kind that gives up. Now, when James Earl Ray heard the shot there at the Lorraine Hotel, he was an escaped convict at the time. So when there's danger around an escaped convict, first thing you do is get out of there. So he hopped in his Mustang and slowly drove away. Well, there was a fellow that was a law enforcement officer, was hired to be there across the street from Lorraine Hotel up on top of a building. His job was to shoot James Earl Ray after the shot was fired. Just like Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, he was supposed to kill James Earl Ray. And in all three deaths, there was a patsy in all those cases. Very similar crime. The reason it is the same people planned all of it. One person wrote the checks to all the killers and all the events, and in my book I give you the check number and the amount of checks that were paid to the killer of Martin Luther King. Lloyd Jowers got $10,000. Carlos Marcello got most of it. There was $1 million contract, and Carlos kept most of it and gave the shooter $10,000. But these are things that happen. Now, this fellow name is Jim Green that was supposed to kill James Earl Ray. He was positioned. He thought James was going to come out of this door over here, and all of a sudden he came out of the door over here. By the time he repositioned his rifle and was ready to shoot, James got away. And James drove to Atlanta. Jim Green followed him to Atlanta, got on the next airplane. They both went to Canada. And Jim missed him by an hour in Canada. He got away and flew to London. From London, he went to Portugal, stayed a couple of weeks, went back to London. Now, I was the last person to interview James Earl Ray before he died in Nashville, Tennessee Prison Hospital, cancer of the liver. And James told me that he was a patsy, and I said, well, but you confessed. And he said, well, the reason I confessed is my attorney told me that if I didn't confess, that I would go to the electric chair. If I confessed, I'd just go to prison for the rest of my life. And besides that, my father was an escaped prisoner from a penitentiary in Oregon, And they said they knew where he was. They weren't really interested in picking him up. He was just another criminal. But if he didn't confess, they were going to pick him up, put him in prison, and keep him in solitary confinement the rest of his life. And that his brother Jerry would be accused of being Raoul, and that Jerry would go to prison for the rest of his life. And so James did confess to the murder, and I think it's a week or two later he started his efforts to try to get a retrial because he confessed under duress, but he was never allowed a retrial. The killer of King, Lloyd Jowers, died of cancer of the throat about a year ago. I was trying desperately to get an interview with him, but the only way I thought that I could get an interview was to do a videotape of this fellow that's in prison in Texas and who was going to dump on him, and then go to Jowers' attorney and see if I could get him to give me an interview, that he was near death and that he really needed to confess before he died, but I didn't make it. But I'm convinced that James Earl Ray could very likely have been a Manchurian candidate because he had a lot of the traits of a person that is under control, and that the real killer was Lloyd Jowers, who owned Jim's Grill at 418 Main Street in Memphis. They killed King because he was speaking out against the Vietnam War all through the South. In fact, was planning to fly to Vietnam and ask the black soldiers to lay down their weapons and not fire again. King tried to discredit him, bring him communist, all sorts of things, and King was lobbying for civil rights for the blacks and was successful. And Lyndon Johnson thought that if blacks had civil rights in the South, that they would probably vote against him in the next election. And so those are the reasons why Martin Luther King was killed. The same people planned it. The same person wrote the checks for Bobby and Jack Kennedy. I have copies of those checks for the King killing at home. And well, I say at home, they're somewhere. Only my attorney knows where they are. But you have the same conspirators. I have Carla DeLoach. He was J. Edgar Hoover's main assistant. John J. McCloy, H.L. Hunt. And being a private citizen, King had no security. By the way, Frank Holloman, I have him listed as a co-conspirator because he was a ex-FBI agent for, I think, 26 years. He was in charge of Memphis Police and Memphis Fire Department, which was located directly across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. So he was complicit in that killing himself. And now the CIA had developed chemicals or drugs that you could give to a person that were odorless, colorless, and it would kill them instantly. Why did not they use these chemicals on these three men? The reason they didn't is they shot them in a shooting gallery before the eyes of the world, and they did it because they could. Now tonight, I've told you who the elite are and were, and I told you about 4 tragic events that the elite were responsible for. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I'm trying to correct history. History is there for us to learn from. And if you can't learn from history, then why do we have history books? And we can't prevent something if the history's wrong. And if now that we know about the killers of these 4 men, if they will revise history, then maybe we can get something changed. And I thank you for coming, and I appreciate your careful attention tonight, and tell everybody that you can see about this story. Thank you very much.